Thanks for being here. As Gareth said, my name is Jake Steinberg, and I'm a reporter at the Minnesota Star Tribune, where I specialize in cartography and environmental storytelling. I'm here today to talk about a story I worked on this past year about a cedar known as the legacy tree. The story began with a simple question from a reader. What is the oldest tree in Minnesota? And as Gareth said, the search for an answer took me places that I never expected it would. It led me to embark on a 5-day dogsled expedition into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is on an Ojibwe homeland that was ceded to the U.S. government in an 1854 treaty. I learned from an Ojibwe elder with a personal connection to this tree about the power and nuances of using Indigenous place names. And in my research, I unearthed beautiful old maps that guided my way and provided inspiration for the design of my story. The result was a story not just about one single tree, but about the memories these trees hold about the people who pass beneath them. Let's start at the beginning. I took the reader's question and began doing research. I found posts in old Boundary Waters message boards that talked about a cedar said to be over 1,000 years old somewhere in the Boundary Waters. If this claim were true, this tree would easily be the oldest living thing in the state. It would have started growing long before Minnesota even was a state. It would date to a time when the archaeological record is scarce, when the Ojibwe and Dakota, as we know them today, did not leave traces on the landscape. We know almost nothing about the people who lived in Minnesota 1,000 years ago. The legacy tree's survival alone would be remarkable. It would have had to survive frequent wildfires and the large-scale clear-cutting of the Boundary Waters in the early 20th century. If this tree were real, I knew I would have to see it for myself. The only problem, the tree was not marked on any map. Those who know about it keep its location secret. I was able to figure out the tree was somewhere on the shore of Basswood Lake, a massive body of water that sits on the US-Canada border. But with 333 miles of coastline, this didn't really bring me any closer to finding it. One person who does know where to find the tree is Paul Shirky. Paul is as close to Yukon Cornelius as a real person can be. He's a polar explorer who has been to the North Pole 7 times, and he lives in a lodge up north with nearly 100 feisty Canadian Inuit sled dogs. He now leads winter dog sled expeditions through his outfitter in Ely, Minnesota. I got in touch with Paul in February and asked if he would take me to the tree. He told me he happened to be taking a group out the following week and offered to let me co-opt the trip for my story. He told me it had been a historically warm winter, and so if I wanted to go, I had to go now. I assembled a hastily assembled urgent pitch to my editors, and within a few days I found myself propelled by 6 tenacious sled dogs into the Boundary Waters wilderness. This was truly no ordinary trip to the Boundary Waters. Typically, the sled dogs glide over portages with feet of snow between the lakes. But this year, we found ourselves trudging through mud and downed logs. Lakes that are typically blanketed in snow were just pure ice. I wiped out more than once crossing the surface, and one from my party went up to his waist going into the water on thin ice. This unseasonable warmth is just one of many consequences of a warming planet. And in addition to the shortened winters, the Northwoods have been jerked between periods of profound drought and deluges of rain in recent years. This climate is unlike anything this ancient cedar has experienced in a millennium. Despite all that it has survived, the legacy tree faces new threats from this unstable climate. What is lost when a tree this old and those like it are gone? This question made reaching the tree to tell a story all the more urgent. After several days in the wilderness, we reached the legacy tree. I stood under its gnarled branches, awed and amazed to be in the presence of such an old living being. Paul's lead dog curled up at the tree's base, and he placed a pinch of tobacco into a crevice in the tree's bark. He does this to carry on a practice taught to him by his friend, Heart Warrior Chosa. Heart Warrior lived in the Boundary Waters on Basswood Lake until the 1990s, well after it was declared a federal wilderness. She would often bring the legacy tree offerings of tobacco. It is customary in Ojibwe culture to bring tobacco to an elder as a sign of respect. She told me the Ojibwe word for cedar is nukomis gishak, which translates to grandmother cedar. The names we give things say a lot about how we relate to them. The Ojibwe word for cedar refers to her as a relative. Place names, as we all know, can carry great significance as well. In Minnesota, we've lost many of our Indigenous place names, and what we have instead are often mistranslated French names that bear little relation to the lakes that they name. A good example of this is Basswood Lake. The current name is an anglicized version of a French name that is itself a mistranslation of the original Ojibwe name, which translates to Lake of Dried Berries. Heart Warrior told me her ancestors used to burn the forest around the lake to cultivate crops of raspberries and blueberries. Heart Warrior gave me the Ojibwe name for the lake, Bateyminan Sagaigan. I should note that I do not speak Ojibwe. A complication emerged when I returned from my trip and presented this spelling to my colleague Mark Boswell, who is a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe. Her spelling differs from that found in the Ojibwe People's Dictionary. It shouldn't be surprising that there are different interpretations of the same words. Ojibwe, like many Indigenous languages, was solely an oral language for much of its history. The language has many dialects and local writing systems, and no one dialect is considered the most prominent or prestigious. There's no standard writing system that covers all dialects. And the US government also intentionally tried to eradicate the language. I wanted to use this original name for the lake in the maps for my story, but as cartographers, we often must settle on one spelling for our maps. So I reached out to a language specialist at the Boy Fort Band of Ojibwe. This further complicated matters. The band recommended I use a third spelling, Basiminani Sagaigan. So I have three potential names for this lake, one from an Ojibwe elder, one from the Ojibwe dictionary, and one from the band most associated with Basswood Lake. After consulting with the Boy Fort Band, here's the compromise I settled on. I went with Basamani Zagaigan on the map because according to the Boy Fort language specialist, it more closely follows the Ojibwe way of naming. However, we also made note indicating that some communities refer to the lake as Bateyminan Zagaigan because it could be how they said it in Heart Warrior's family. We also did end up deferring to the Ojibwe dictionary spelling for that one, again, only after consulting with the language specialist. So a couple takeaways about this experience. I think we should always be reaching out to Indigenous communities, first to get permission to use the name, and then get perspective on which name we should be using. And we need to be prepared to embrace the uncertainty, embrace pluralism, because many spellings are often common. And then assuming the first two are true, I think we should surface Indigenous place names when we have the chance. Because they're often much more historically and culturally rich than the colonial names that took their place. This is NACIS, so we should talk about map design. With this story, I faced a cartographic challenge. How do you map the memory of a tree? Well, to do that, we need to talk about wood. I'm sure you're all familiar with rings, with tree rings, but there is more information here than just the number of years that the tree was alive. For example, a ring's width can vary depending on the environment. You can see here that the drought years are much thinner than the normal years. A tree that survives a wildfire will have a burn scar from that fire, which is very common in red pine, which dominates in northern Minnesota. I'm not the first person to think about how you could map the information found in these rings. This is Myron Heinzelman. He was a Forest Service ecologist and an early dendrochronologist. Dendrochronology is the study of tree rings, and it's really fascinating. If you meet a dendrochronologist, you should buy them lunch and just listen to what they say. That's how I got here. Dendrochronologists use a corer to pull a pencil-thin sliver segment from a tree. That way they can study the rings without harming the tree. The core on the right is from a cedar in the Boundary Waters that dates to at least 1451. Heinzelman spent his career in the Boundary Waters boring cores from trees, counting the rings, and figuring out which years had fires that blazed through particular areas in the Boundary Waters. He then annotated USGS topographic maps with his findings. I don't know if Heinzelman had any cartographic training, but he had a real clear eye for design. I love his use of bold primary colors to convey fires in areas that were logged. I also love the annotations on his maps. You can see him correcting himself and even leaving little notes to himself. These maps are a visual representation of hundreds of years' worth of fires, recorded in the cambium of these trees. Fire is only the beginning of what these old trees record in their rings, but this proved a potent illustration for the story. After georeferencing these maps and digitizing their fire perimeters, I had the data that would help me convey this concept of tree memory. I originally wanted the maps to live side by side with a tree core, but technological limitations forced us to separate these concepts into two separate visualizations. You're probably wondering how I ever figured out the actual age of the legacy tree. I eventually tracked the original estimate to Boundary Waters researchers Clifford and Isabel Algren. In their book, Lob Trees in the Wilderness, they write about boring a core from the legacy tree in the 1960s. They counted 600 rings. However, the core of the tree was hollow, the core meaning the inner rings. This is common in trees this old. The core rots away, but the tree survives. As a result, the Algrens had to extrapolate the number of remaining rings that it would have taken to fill the gap to the center of the tree. Doing this, they estimated the tree was over 1,100 years old. Many modern dendrochronologists I spoke to are skeptical of trusting extrapolations and estimates like this, so if I truly wanted to know how old the cedar was, I decided I'd have to core it myself. I had never cored a tree before, but as this email indicates, I watched a YouTube video on it, and it seemed easy enough. But then I thought about the ramifications if I ended up killing this culturally significant tree. Did I really want to risk harming it? I didn't have to decide, because it turns out there was no time to get a research permit from the Forest Service anyway. I did have a backup plan for verifying the Algren's age estimate. It turned out the University of Minnesota kept all their publications in an unheated cabin on the edge of the Boundary Waters. I spent several hours in there digging around, trying to find any pictures, samples, or papers about the tree. I didn't find anything. But what I did find are many other very fascinating maps. In addition to Heinzelman's maps, they became inspiration for the design for the maps in my story. Many of them feature similar traits: shading done by hand with colored pencils, handwritten annotations, and yellowing old topographic maps. I wanted to develop these maps into a pastiche style. A pastiche is a style that seeks to imitate the style of another work. It does this by imitating things like the form, color, type, and texture of a pre-existing style. This example of a pop art map is from my grad school notes. If you made it, I would love to give you credit for it. I broke my reference style into its component parts and constructed a style guide out of those pieces. It features things like handwritten fonts, sketched fills, and other artifacts of these old topographic maps. I also took a real liking to Heinzelman's handwriting after spending so many hours with his maps, and so I turned his personal script into glyphs that I used throughout the story. These are the maps that appeared in the story. You'll have to forgive the low contrast on the projector. You'll notice when I show them side by side, something stark is revealed. In the area where the forest had been clear-cut, there was no fire record for Heinzelman to find. All the trees had been cut down, so there was nothing to remember those fires by. This loss is especially stark when you consider that many of these fires were set by indigenous peoples, who used fire to cultivate the land for berry crops and hunting grounds. In losing the trees, just as with losing the names, we lose a record of their presence on the landscape. One thing that you'll notice is not on my map is the location of the legacy tree. When I was at the tree, I saw visibly cut limbs and torn bark. I believe locating a tree like this in the state's largest news organization would do far more harm than good. Part of the mystique of this tree is that you must seek it out, just as I did, and just as people have likely done for 1,000 years. I'll also note that I never was able to verify the 1,100-year age estimate. I don't think anyone ever will know how old the legacy tree truly is. As one of my sources put it, the oldest looking trees aren't willing to give that info up. They tend to be hollow. Their stories tend to be lost to time. I think that mystery is part of what is so compelling about these old trees. It's what compelled me to go on this journey, and I think we as cartographers should seek out those stories and try to think about what the trees may remember that we do not. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to my colleague Mark Boswell, who liked the idea of pastiche so much that he drew this self-portrait. I'm going to drop a link to the story on Slack. However, the Star Tribune recently did a complete rebuild of our website and CMS, so it might send you to the desktop site if you view it on mobile. Do we have any questions? One question?
Okay, yeah, we've got time for one question. And I'm going to go to the hand that's closest to me. I'm sorry, Joshua.
What kind of maps did you or your guide use when navigating to get to the legacy tree?
That's a great question. Paul Shirky he basically lives in the Boundary Waters all winter, so I'm not sure that he really even needs a map to get around. There was one time when his son is also a guide for his outfitter, and he was going to meet us out there. And we were at this point 3 days into the wilderness, and one morning we just see this figure off in the horizon, and we just see this man alone skiing across the lake. And so I think if you're just like these people, you just know where you're going.
Impressive.
All right, thank you so much, Jake. Appreciate it.